Well, Solanus, Barney was his baptismal name, Bernard. Blessed Solanus was a farm kid from Wisconsin. He was the sixth of 16 kids. His family was from Ireland, and he grew up on farms in northern Wisconsin, Prescott and Trimble. And he, as a teenager, he left home, as many farm kids did, so he could go out and get a job and send money back to the family. So he did a variety of jobs. He worked as a logger, he worked as a part time prison warden, and because he left home, he actually didn't finish high school until he was 17, and that's going to have an impact on his story later on. So one of the jobs he got after he finished high school was he was working on a trolley in Superior, Wisconsin, and he experienced an act of violence. Apparently, a woman was stabbed and found on the trolley tracks right in front of him. And that was a trigger for him to rethink his ministry, his vocation. He knew that he couldn't withdraw from the world and simply pray about peace. He had to do something about it. So within a couple of days, he decided that he was going to be a priest. He, in Wisconsin, of course, he was sent to the seminary, St. Francis Seminary in Milwaukee. He started there when he was about 21, but he started high school. So he was as many as 7 or maybe even 8 years older than some of his classmates. And St. Francis Seminary was designed to train clergy to serve the German speaking population of Milwaukee. So many of the professors, most of the professors were fluent in German. It was a Germanic cultural environment. Solanus originally did, or Barney at that point, originally did well. But the longer he stayed, the more difficult the studies became, the German, the Latin, the Germanic environment. And so after his first year of college, he was invited out of the school. They don't like to say he was expelled, but he was expelled for academic reasons. But they said, you're a good guy and you probably have a vocation, and you should look at some religious community. So the Capuchins, of course, were in Milwaukee, same place we are now at St. Francis, and he visited them. He was not very impressed. He didn't like the beards. He didn't think the Capuchins were, you know, the place he was being called. He eventually went back to spend time with his family, and he and his mother and one of his sisters did a novena to the Blessed Virgin. And in the midst of that novena, he got some kind of message. Now, we have to be cautious that it wasn't like a voice from heaven, but he did get this kind of internal message that said, go to Detroit. Which is where our novitiate was, St. Bonaventure Monastery, which is still there, but no longer the novitiate. So he went to Detroit. He was a little unsure when he got there, but he actually arrived on Christmas Eve. And on festivals, we used to wake the friars up with, in the morning, we used to wake them up by slapping boards together. But on festivals, you would use the chimes, the bells from the church, and incense. And that was like he said, I'm home. Um, so he continued to struggle with his academics. He, even before he made his final vows, his superiors made him sign a testimony saying that his future life was in their hands. He wasn't saying, I have to be a priest. He was very, very, it's amazing how humble and obedient he was. At a second time, he had struggles with his theological studies, not only because of the languages, but he also was not a person who was terribly analytic. And there was some concern, for example, if he was in a confessional situation, could he really understand what the sin was and what an appropriate absolution or penance would be? So, right before he was ordained, he had to do another testimony saying that he would do whatever his superiors decided. And they did decide to ordain him, so he was ordained, but he remained at the status of what's called a simplex priest, which means he was ordained like everybody else. There's no separate ordination process for simplex, but he was never given faculties to hear confessions. He was never given the faculties to publicly preach dogmatic sermons as they had to do. And so they didn't quite know what to do with him. His first assignment was in Yonkers at Sacred Heart Parish there. New York was part of the province, the Detroit province at that time. And he was in charge of the sacristy, and he was in charge of altar boys, and eventually they made him at another parish the guy who answered the door. He was the porter. And he would answer the door if people needed something or if they wanted to see somebody, and he would direct them to different people. But eventually he became the reason why people came to the door. And he became in charge of what was called the Seraphic Mass Association. We now call it the Solanus Mission Association, which people would have masses said for various occasions, for various purposes. And he began getting stories of folk. Somebody was sick, and they'd have a mass said through the Seraphic Mass Association, and then they got better. And this happened with such frequency that his superiors finally said, I want you to start writing these things down. And at the time of his death, there were 14 notebooks that had over 6,000 entries. And they weren't all cures, but many of them were favors that happened, and he always attributed, never to himself, but always to the Seraphic Mass Association. He was moved back to Detroit in 1924. That was probably his most famous stint as the door answerer. He had so many people writing to him, and he ended up getting secretaries to help him. He was an incredibly hard worker. He stayed very close to his family, but often it would take him, he would start to write them a letter, and then he would put it off into the next day, and often he would be writing at the end of this letter, sorry, it's 11 o'clock at night, I have 50 more letters on my desk, it's time to go to bed, because then he would get up at 5 in the morning for prayer. So sanctity is not for the lazy. And he really demonstrated that he was a very hardworking, very unpretentious. They eventually moved him into semi-retirement, first to New York and then to Huntington, Indiana, which was the novitiate. And he was there for about 10 or 11 years, and then as his health got very frail, they moved him back to Detroit, and he died in Detroit in 1957. Saying at the end of his life that he gives his life to Jesus. So very unpretentious, very unassuming. 20,000 people came to pay their respects. They had so many people coming that they could not, usually they would put the friar for the wake in the chapel at St. Bonaventure. There were so many people, they had to move him to a funeral home, which was unheard of for Capuchins. And they used to bury us in wood. And they put him in steel because they knew something was possible. So he was buried in the cemetery in the backyard of St. Bonaventure's, and then eventually he was exhumed and moved into the transept of that chapel, and eventually when the Solanus Casey Center was built, that became his final resting place.